From high atop the battlements of Castle Curmudgeon, where this weekend has seen one of the greatest living Americans, perhaps the greatest living American, pass from our midst. James Arthur Lovell Jr., Cleveland, Ohio, Captain, U.S. Navy, pilot, Gemini 7, Commander, Gemini 12, Command Module Pilot, Apollo 8, and most famously, Commander Apollo 13, passed away on Friday at his home in Lake Forest, Illinois, at the age of 97. This is the 82nd episode of the Blast Radius, and we have now marked the passing of all three of the men of Apollo 8. Frank Borman on 7 November 2023, Bill Anders on 7 June 2024, and now Jim Lovell 7 August 2025. There now remain only 5 men living who have flown to the moon. Buzz Aldrin, Apollo 11, Fred Hayes, Apollo 13, Dave Scott, Apollo 15, Charlie Duke, Apollo 16, and Senator Jack Schmidt, Apollo 17. I sat down this morning to write the news roundup, as I normally do, and I said, you know what? The hell with the news roundup. When our greatest heroes leave us, we need to do better than just giving it a momentary notice and maybe typing a little one-line comment and then scrolling along to the next bit of rage bait. We should give such men a farewell that befits the service and the dedication and the excellence that they rendered to our nation and to its people. And so tonight, instead of a news roundup, you are getting a proper, full-length Jim Lovell obituary. And if your knowledge of Captain Lovell derives solely from having watched Tom Hanks portray him in the Apollo 13 movie from 1995, there isn't any shame in that, but there's a lot more about the actual Jim Lovell that you really ought to know. For the United States of America never produced a more decent, more honorable, more capable, more accomplished son than they produced in the baby boy that was born to Mr. and Mrs. James Lovell Sr. on 25 March 1928. Jim Lovell Sr. was a Canadian-born furnace salesman who perished in a car crash when his son Jim Jr. was only 5 years old, so it fell to his mother, the former Blanche Masick, to raise her only child as a single mother during the Great Depression, when being a single mother was exceedingly more rare than it is today. Jim Lovell, just like most children of the Depression, recalled his early childhood as a time of poverty and privation. He and his mother lived with her relatives in Terre Haute, Indiana, for several years after his father's death, before moving to Milwaukee, Wisconsin, where Jim attended Juneau High School, played football, became a Boy Scout, then an Eagle Scout, and developed a keen interest in model airplanes, model rocketry, and all other things flight-related. He matriculated at the University of Wisconsin in 1946 under the Navy ROTC program, and in 1948 entered pre-flight training as a prospective naval aviator. But then the Navy killed the ROTC program that had gained him entry into the service because they had so many pilots left over from the war, there weren't enough planes for them all to fly. So Lovell, in a somewhat unusual move, secures an endorsement from his local congressman and applies to the Naval Academy in Annapolis, and he gets accepted. He gives up the commission he has already had as a naval ensign and drops back down all the way to the level of a plebe midshipman in his freshman year, perhaps presaging his future career path. He authors a treatise on liquid-propelled rocket engines, and in 1952 he graduates with a Bachelor of Science and gains his second Navy commission. Of the 783 midshipmen who graduated Annapolis that year, 50 of them were accepted into pilot training, one of whom was Ensign Lovell, which stands to reason since he had already completed a fair portion of the training 4 years earlier. He attends flight training at Pensacola Naval Air Station in Florida from October of 52 to February of 54. So unlike some of his other NASA colleagues who were around the same age, he never flies combat missions in Korea. His first assignment is to VC-3 out of Moffett Field in Northern California, and he spends the years 1954 to 56 flying the F-2H Banshee off the aircraft carrier USS Shangri-La. And it's during this period where he has the incident, which was in the movie, where he was attempting a night landing and lost all electrical power in the aircraft and was lucky enough to spot the trail of phosphorescent algae that was being churned up by the carrier's propeller screws, and he manages to find his way back to the ship. Some might call it a crash landing, but if Lovell were here, he would say, hey, I caught the last wire and I only blew out 2 tires, so that is not a crash. He completes a total of 107 night carrier landings during his time aboard Shangri-La, which is quite a tremendous number for the early 1950s. And then in January of 58, after a stretch as an instructor pilot, he is accepted into Navy Test Pilot School, where he graduates at the top of Class 20, ahead of his future NASA colleagues Pete Conrad and Wally Schirra. And speaking of NASA, it starts existing in the same year that Lovell completes Test Pilot School, and the new agency puts out a call for astronaut candidates. Lovell, Conrad, and Schirra are all among the 110 test pilots selected as finalists for the Mercury program, but despite having just about the best non-combat flying credentials of any of the candidates, Lovell doesn't get selected, as one of the Mercury 7 because the flight surgeons thought his kidneys weren't functioning as perfectly as they would have liked. Wally Schirra, he gets accepted as one of the Mercury 7. And Lovell never publicly said that chapped his ass, but I bet that chapped his ass. It would have chapped my ass, at any rate. In 1960, with his dream of being a NASA astronaut temporarily dashed, he becomes the electronics program manager on the F-4 Phantom program, during which time another one of his future NASA colleagues, John Young, Commander Apollo 16, Commander STS-1, among other things, serves under his command. By 1962, with the Mercury program winding down, NASA decides it needs a new crop of astronauts for the Gemini and Apollo programs. So they took out an ad in Aviation Week magazine, which is the way these things were done in those days. And Lovell says, what the hell? Might as well apply a second time. He survives the first cut down to 32 finalists. Then he gets sent to Brooks Air Force Base in Texas for the same set of medical tests that got him rejected the first time around. But the flight surgeons are less concerned about his kidney function than they were a few years ago. So he survives the second cut down to 27 finalists who are sent to Ellington Air Force Base to appear before a 3-man review board, including the Mercury astronauts Deke Slayton and Al Shepard. Lovell is among the 9 men selected for astronaut training, but he doesn't know that yet. He gets a call from Deke Slayton, who orders him to report to the Rice Hotel in Houston and check in under the name Max Peck. It's a strange set of instructions, but Lovell does as he's told, and he doesn't realize what's going on until he gets to the hotel bar and sees a bunch of guys he knows: Pete Conrad, John Young, Jim McDivitt, Neil Armstrong, and so on. So since they were all test pilots, and some of them rocket scientists, it didn't take them long to put 2 and 2 together. The 9 of us have been selected as astronaut group 2, but NASA didn't want the word getting out until they had called the press conference, and that's why we are all here, and that was the reason for all of the Max Peck cloak and dagger bullshit. The next 2 years are spent on lots of classroom instruction, lots of jungle survival training, lots of desert survival training, lots of water survival training, which, if it was me, that would not have instilled me with a whole lot of confidence in my new employer when they didn't even have a best guess on what kind of terrain they were planning for me to get lost in. But finally, in July of 64, Jim Lovell gets his first backup crew assignment on Gemini 4, which is the flight where Ed White conducted the first EVA by an American. And according to the rotation system, that means that he and Frank Borman will be the prime crew on Gemini 7. And aside from conducting history's first on-orbit rendezvous with Gemini 6, there wasn't much to get excited about on the Gemini 7 flight. It was simply a matter of stay up there for 2 weeks and let's see if you die. Since obviously, if we are going to fly men to the moon, we first have to establish that men can stay alive in outer space for the length of time that such a mission will require. So Lovell and Borman are cooped up together in a cockpit just about the size of a Volkswagen Beetle for 14 days without much to do to pass the time, except to read a Mark Twain book and complain about the design of the poop bags. And the amount of engineering that went into redesigning those poop bags could fill up its own video, which I'm sure someone has already made. Lovell next flies as Commander Gemini 12, which is not just the final mission of the Gemini program, but it's also the mission that first establishes that men can perform useful work in the vacuum of outer space. The first EVA, the Ed White EVA on Gemini 4, that was just a matter of get out and float around for a few minutes and then get back in. On Gemini 9, Gene Cernan tried to get out and perform some useful work, but it was a total failure, and nearly a fatal one. Nobody had fully considered the amount of handholds and footholds that are required even just to turn a wrench in the vacuum of space, because just like Sir Isaac Newton surmised, the force of turning the wrench and the bolt results in an equal and opposite force being exerted on the astronaut's entire body. So Cernan winds up dumping 12 gallons of sweat and nearly giving himself a heart attack just in the act of trying to perform these simple few experimental tasks. It's Jim Lovell's crewmate on Gemini 12, Edwin Aldrin, Buzz to his friends, who first gets the idea to practice these procedures in a giant swimming pool, as that's the only way to approximate zero gravity while still on Earth. And he invents all the procedures that are still used to this very day. Everything comes off with nary a hitch, and Gemini 12 is the most successful U.S. spaceflight up to that point. Lovell's next flight is Apollo 8. Though the Apollo 8 crew was originally assigned to Apollo 9, but due to a combination of the lunar module not being ready yet and a rumor, which turned out to be bullshit, that the Soviets were going to attempt a manned circumlunar flight before the end of 1968, the Apollo 8 and 9 crews, they swapped spacecraft, and it is decided to make Apollo 8, with the crew of Borman, Lovell, and Anders, humanity's first foray beyond low Earth orbit. And again, and the importance of this can't be overstated. They flew that mission without a lunar module, and all of its systems that became so crucial later during the Apollo 13 disaster. If the oxygen tank malfunction that happened on 13 had happened on 8, which it just as well could have done, there would have been no chance of surviving or returning home. We would still have 3 astronaut corpses out there orbiting the sun somewhere. Attempting that flight was something that would never be attempted in 1,000 years in today's congenitally risk-averse NASA culture. But that is how seriously we took the Cold War back in those days. If there's a chance the Soviets are going to attempt a similar flight, we have to try and beat them, and we have to accept whatever risks there are. Bill Anders estimated privately that they had a 1 chance in 3 of returning home alive, and he probably wasn't too far off in that assessment. But in the event, which was also the first manned flight of the Saturn V launch vehicle, the flight went just beautifully. We got the first photographs of the entire planet Earth. We got the famous Christmas Eve reading of the first passage of the book of Genesis, a plan which was conceived and executed solely by the 3 crewmen. NASA management gave them no instructions except say something appropriate. And just try to imagine astronauts being given that much leeway in the present day. But you can't, because it would never happen. And Apollo 8 winds up being the last and final death knell of the space race. We had won. We had got to the moon first. The Soviets abandoned their lunar landing program altogether and turned instead to developing space stations. Lovell's only got 1 flight remaining in his career now, and it's the one that everybody knows about. Apollo 13. On that mission, he becomes the first man to fly in space 4 times and the first man to fly to the moon twice. So the original plan was for him and Fred Hayes to land and walk around for a couple days, but the number 2 oxygen tank in the service module had other plans. And the feat of leadership that Jim Lovell pulled off on that flight, of setting all other things aside and focusing solely on getting your men home alive from a failed mission, it's an achievement that I've often compared to the achievement of Sir Ernest Shackleton during the failed Imperial Transantarctic Expedition of 1914-16. It's easy to say that any other commander could have just as well pulled it off. Jim Lovell himself was always quick to say that he thought that. He didn't think he deserved any special credit. He thought the people on the ground in Houston deserved more of the credit than he and Hayes and Swigert did. But he was being entirely too modest in the view of this reporter. I don't think any other commander could have pulled it off. They had to invent all the procedures they used out of thin air and whole cloth. They had to solve all of their trajectory problems in the middle of a life and death emergency by doing arithmetic with pencil and paper. The movie dramatizes the events to some degree, but not really all that much. When they had to do a course correction burn using the descent engine on the lunar module, a scenario that nobody had ever remotely contemplated, it really was like trying to fly with a dead elephant on their back. They really did have no means of orienting the spacecraft except by trying to keep the Earth in the window. They really did have to build a CO2 filter adapter out of cardboard and plastic sheeting and duct tape and a sweat sock. Were the efforts of the men on the ground completely invaluable? Yes, obviously, very much so they were. But I reject Lovell's assertion that any other commander could have done it just as well. In fact, I think that's bullshit. I think only Jim Lovell could have done what Jim Lovell did. In the story of the Apollo program, we often hear stories about how the demands of that life and that career caused the disintegration of many astronaut marriages, and that certainly is true. But it's worth noting, I think, that the 3 men of Apollo 8 all married well, and only once. Frank and Susan Borman, Jim and Marilyn Lovell, Bill and Valerie Anders, those are 3 great American marriages that were crucial in making those men 3 of America's greatest heroes. And I feel like I have probably talked long enough at this point. There's not much else to say except Godspeed, Captain Lovell. A grateful nation wishes you fair winds and following seas. You will never be forgotten so long as the United States of America continue to exist. Thank you for your service and for your example. May you rest in peace and honor and glory.